Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the seminar series, The Prospects of Criticism, part of our joint research project with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of the Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 26th of October 2022, Professor Jonathan Neufeld from the College of Charleston, South Carolina, discusses the concept of aesthetic civil disobedience. Is there such a thing as distinctively aesthetic civil disobedience that can be distinguished from civil disobedience more generally? If there is, how does the aesthetic nature of such disobedience affect its status as societal critique?
Good. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Jonathan Neufeld to our discussion group. Jonathan is well known to most of us, of course, and you've participated in some of these seminars already. You are associate professor at Charleston, and you've worked extensively on political art, but also the philosophy of music. And you've always been interested, as far as I can remember, questions relating philosophy of law or the law with art. But at the same time, you've also written a fair amount of music criticism, which makes you, of course, a very well-placed person to be part of this discussion group. So we're very happy to be able to welcome you here today. We've circulated your paper on aesthetic civil disobedience, and as always, we'll try to aim in about an hour and an hour 10 minutes from now. So welcome, Jonathan.
All right. Thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for having the format. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to attend more of these. It lands at a bad teaching time for me. So it's which is why it's on a Wednesday today. So thanks for coming on a weird day. And thanks to Guy, John, and Elizabeth for the invitation to submit something. And so the rough definition, or sort of working definition, is just acts of civil disobedience break some law in order to publicly draw attention to and recommend the reform of a conflict between the commitments of a legal system and some shared commitments of the community. So very, very general. Here are the 5 elements of that. So I take these to be central characteristics of civil disobedience. You might tweak certain of them in certain ways, but they violate the law, civil disobedience, accept the risk of legal punishment for their actions. So this is language from Kimberly Brownlee. Used to be the case that you would just accept punishment. But this seems to exclude too many kinds of civil disobedience where you don't accept punishment and you avoid it as much as you can. And yet it would still be weird to call it something other than civil disobedience. The acts are performed publicly. They're communicative. So that's the element that I'm going to draw attention to later on. And they aim to draw attention to a conflict or a set of conflicts for the legal authority and shared normative commitments of a community. Those commitments might be moral commitments, they might be commitments to rights, they might be commitments to equality, they might be commitments to freedom. Pick your normative commitments. Again, it's deliberately thin so as to accommodate a number of different versions of this. And then finally, the acts aim to promote a particular state of affairs within the legal system. And something worth mentioning here, all of my examples are sort of progressive, reform-minded examples. And I used to say the acts aim to promote a particular, a particular change within a legal system. But the more we've seen protests recently, there have been protests to maintain the status quo. There have been civilly disobedience acts to maintain the legal system as it is, or to call attention to the goodness of a legal system, and so forth. So this cuts in 2 different directions. One, you can have a progressive defense of the status quo, which is sort of interesting, and you can have regressive acts of civil disobedience. So I don't talk about right-wing regressive acts of civil disobedience, but there are such. So the change in that last, I've changed that last element for those reasons. The same will happen in aesthetic disobedience. So I've given this talk a few times now, and people are like, what about Nazi protests? Nazi protests are a special case. I think they don't count because there's not an ethos of a democratic ethos behind it. But right wing, okay. So I drew a parallel in an old article to practices in the art world that I call aesthetic disobedience. And there are acts, I think, of transformation, reform, rebellion within art worlds that are relatively well known to us, that are often called revolutionary. And so revolution is thrown around quite liberally in art talk. I think that it's become cliche in a way that makes it descriptively unhappy to talk about revolution. And I think that it actually is descriptively inaccurate and doesn't capture a lot of really interesting transgressive acts within the art world that are more happily captured by a parallel to civil disobedience. And so I run in my 2015 article this parallel within the art world, an account of aesthetic disobedience that aims to transform the art world instead of the law, but otherwise the characteristics are basically the same. So you have a definition or a working definition here that looks very much like the civil disobedience definition, and then you get 5 characteristics of aesthetic disobedience that change the legal system to the art world, and that's basically the only change. So I think this is a descriptively happy account of lots of different kinds of interventions in art worlds. So part of what brought me to talk about aesthetic disobedience in the first place, like I mentioned before, is that, and I'll start paying attention to the chat, by the way, well, I don't need to share that with you. Is the sort of varieties of political interventions of artists into the public sphere, into public space. And I originally sort of collapsed the two concepts, aesthetic civil disobedience and aesthetic disobedience. And through the encouragement of Brian Socek in particular, he pushed me to separate these into two different concepts because they have two different aims. One, to transform the art world, the other to transform politics or the legal system in a particular way. And so this paper focuses on the latter and wonders why it is that art thinks that it can have a distinctive, whether art has or aesthetic gestures have a distinctive kind of contribution to make to politics, and if so, what that looks like. So before I get to that, I just sort of set out why it is that we might want to call something aesthetic civil disobedience instead of what I mean by aesthetic civil disobedience, and whether it's distinctive from ordinary acts of disobedience that just have a certain branding or something to it. So the cases that I talk about are Pussy Riot and why are you not going? Okay, there we go. So I'll just show you quickly the video. So this is the actual event in the church. Sounded more or less like this. I'll just move on to the next. So this is the video that you're probably more familiar with. All right, good enough. So I'll just leave it at that. So that's one example. Another example that is lovely is the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene, which looks like this. It's a huge monument in the middle of a park. And somebody put a statue, pretty nicely made statue, of a bust of Snowden. They illegally installed it on top of a pillar. Good. I'll just leave it at that. There are interesting things to be said about how they did this and how they did it in a way that was not harmful to the statue. How the parks organization, after they took it down, they like called the parks organization, "Can we have our statue back? We'd like to install it somewhere else." And so it ended up having legs later on in the art world that makes it an interesting case. Finally, there have been a number of interventions at Monument Avenue that I discussed. So Monument Avenue no longer looks like this after 2020. All of these statues have been taken down, including the Lee statue, which was the last and first, the first erected and the last to be taken down, because Lee is a significant figure around who people have been trying for 150 years to save from his actual history. And so Monument Avenue looked like this. One intervention that I talk about with the small plaques, the plaques look like this. They bolted them on so that they would have to be destroyed in order to take them off the fences. And nobody in the Parks Department wanted to do that. Nobody in the city wanted to do that. They kept on passing the buck. So it ended up being a nice bureaucratic mess that this intervention made. But it's aesthetically significant in this sort of monumental context, I claim. And then finally, the recent protests ended up looking like this before the statues were taken down. So I'll just blaze through these very quickly. So who cares? So the point of the paper is to say, look, these acts are distinctive, and the reason that they're distinctive is because the difference that what happens to CD3, civil disobedience 3, which is the same as aesthetic disobedience 3, which is the acts are performed publicly and they're communicative. The reason they're different, the way that they're different, is that I claim that the act's aesthetic structure is an integral part of their public communicative function. So that the acts look the way they do, that the acts draw on artistic history, aesthetic presentational history, the way that they do plays an internal role to the structure of their public reason. And so the significant bit of CD and 83 is that that's the democratic element, right? This is the part where deliberative Democrats say, yeah, that's what civil disobedience is about. And to within the deliberative democratic sphere, inserting something like an aesthetic element, if it's not reduced to ordinary propositional discursive reason giving, fits a little bit sideways. And so I want to argue that it shouldn't, and we should be able to integrate such things because they happen all the time, and they seem to, these artistic and aesthetic gestures play a central role in the kinds of deliberations we've been having, not only about monuments, which are kind of easy cases, but in protests more generally. This has always been the case, I think, but in protests more generally about a wide variety of political topics. So the goal is to open up space and to figure out how it is that aesthetic or artistic structure can be a part of public reason. So the first bit of the paper is just, no, seriously, there is such a thing as aesthetic civil disobedience. And the last part of the paper gestures to how that aesthetic works in public reason, and it's not fully worked out and needs, I think, to be worked out in a separate paper. This was meant to be an introduction to one paper, but it turned into two. So the last little bit that I'll say is, how does it fit within public reason? There are two different ways, I think. One is the weaker way to say, well, it doesn't really fit into public reason, but it catalyzes public reason. So it stands outside of public reason itself, but it reshapes public reason by making people think of different topics, right? So I endorse this. This is a perfectly good way of thinking about some of these interventions. And you might think about it in cases for just establishing recognition of people who have a voice or have something to say about a particular topic that you might not have noticed before there was a significant flashpoint in the public sphere that was aesthetically driven, say. Iris Marion Young sometimes talks in a way that seems to support this view. But the we can talk about that if you want. But the stronger claim that I'd like to make is that the aesthetic and artistic structure is actually part of the deliberation itself, part of public reason itself. And I'm more than tempted to endorse this. I now endorse this. So the reason why you might, so since the argument is rooted in what's typically a discursive account of public justification from Rawls and Habermas and all of the later deliberativists, the stronger claim depends on one of two things, one that Simonidi does and one that I want to do. And the one that I think Simonidi does is that you could say that the aesthetic or artistic structure is compatible with a discursive count of justification. And I think Martha Nussbaum does this because she says that, I think Tina Nguyen does something like this in his account of what public art is about. And both of them present us with the sort of the importance of the presentation of artistic objects is in their sort of emotional expression. And both have relatively strongly cognitive accounts of what emotional expression is. And so it's easy to see how a discursive account of deliberation would accommodate an emotional expression that has a very strong cognitive content. And so you could fold this into ordinary public reasoning relatively easily, I think. I think that's also where Simonidi ends up, is somewhere near this, where the aesthetic content of works of art gesture toward political contents and can deliver political contents, even though they deliver them in a wide variety of ways, pluralism of ways. The outcome is still an ordinary discursive outcome, I think. So I think the other way of thinking about this is to take the form of the work more seriously and to take what I'm calling the aesthetic structure of the work more seriously. That's not as easily discharged in, I think it's not dischargeable in discursive form, where the sort of critical encounter with the aesthetic object itself and the aesthetic object itself are doing work together so that the structure of the work is contributing to public discourse. I think that's different than saying the content of the content of the work is political content differently presented, and that the kinds of reasons that you get falling out of an encounter with dancing teenagers around a spray-painted space is a transformation of the space without a specific political content. It's a shift in the way that we can think about this space, say Monument Avenue, which is different than a discursive claim made about the space, or even a specific discursive recommendation to change the space in a particular way. Punkt. That's what I hope to do. So that was much longer than I thought I was going to do, but Elizabeth said, go a little longer if you want, so I did.
Good.
So
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, good.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. That's great, very, very helpful, and certainly a great angle from which to think about, the critical power of art as we're doing within this project. Perhaps if you could stop sharing the screen so we see each other just a little bit better, that'd be great. Thank you very much. And then please put up your hands, the hand function or the chat. I can monitor both of those things. And Guy, you have your hand up, and then Martin.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Extremely well put and very relevant. In fact, I have two questions. One is the super actual in the sense that there were these recent protests, which I imagine will spread. One with the National Gallery in London, another one in Berlin, people pouring mashed potato and tomato soup over Monet and Van Gogh and various things. And the question about that is does that count as an act of aesthetic civil disobedience? It seems to fulfill some of the criteria. At the same time, it seems to be saying that aesthetics pales into insignificance when we consider the climate crisis more generally, and that we should just stop thinking about art at all. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is there's a great deal of focus, particularly in Vitsimanity's piece, but also in yours, courtesy of the kind of rules framework, on the effectiveness of this characterization of civil disobedience or aesthetic civil disobedience in the idea that art communicates proposition. And it seems to me that that's obviously an important focus. But another aspect of these things seems to me to be that a great deal of contributions of communicative acts, both political and not political, but nonetheless participants in rational discourse, are simple acts of showing that something is the case, without necessarily giving a political interpretation. So this would cover all sorts of things, even within the kind of discourse of academic scholarship, where scholars will just dig up something in an archive and just simply put it out there and give an account of what it is. They're not giving an argument about why it's relevant. The grounds for relevance are decided to a certain extent by the framework. And it seems to me that artists do this the whole time, whether they are explicitly being political or not. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily cross over into civil disobedience. There's no necessary law breaking involved in that. But I wonder whether one needs to be quite so focused on propositions. That's the second question. So tomato soup and propositions.
So I'll actually go in the order. So it's a strange target to pick if the argument is to make this less significant, right? Well, I guess it's the choice of the National Gallery and the choice of works to protest shows the significance of an aesthetic intervention into political space, right? So I think it works quite nicely as an account of aesthetic disobedience, for sure, that the art world should be, depends what we're really caring about. But I think that it's an intervention into the art world, that it should care about things that it care more about things that it doesn't. And it should direct resources in a way that it doesn't. And here, the art world is this broad set of institutions that that put forward that put way out front puzzling things sometimes. And one of the ways of drawing attention to that is to do damage to the public, to those things, right? Or to show how visceral people's attachment is to these strange objects of value versus the burning world right outside. So it seems like a pretty clear example of aesthetic disobedience, of aesthetic disobedience. So targeting the art world, and because it's an illegal act, it overlaps nicely with aesthetic civil disobedience as well. So it's the only, I guess the question would be, is that what a sort of a democratic intervention looks like? I think yes. So I think it counts as both. And this is part of the reason that when I first started doing this, all of my examples were both aesthetic disobedience and aesthetic civil disobedience. I think this is a really nice example of that. Is that an adequate answer to the tomato soup? Okay, good. And the why focusing on propositions? Because political philosophy focuses on propositions. The original intervention into the deliberative democratic discourse for me. I am a political philosopher at heart, not really an esthetician. I started life as a political philosopher and as a Rawlsian and a deliberative Democrat, and so I was sort of steeped in that sort of political account of political justification, which is like propositional through and through, and the only has been traditionally, especially in the deliberativist crowd, propositional through and through. So people like Linda Zerilli and Iris Marion Young, and then as you go farther into the radical democratic sphere, push back hard against the merely propositional nature of political deliberation. And I wish that often the radical Democrats step out, like Chantal Mouffe and people like this and Rancière, when they stop focusing on propositional justification, think they need to abandon justification altogether, which is a overly hasty move. And so it would be nice to integrate the critique of people like Rancière and Mouffe, who have a good sense of the way that, or Albrecht Bellmer, for example, who have a good sense of how art can intervene into publicity in reshaping the way we deploy the propositions we already have, or that intervene in such a way that that is non-propositional but politically significant and has something to do with political justification. And so I don't want to go Rancière and give up on, or Mouffe and give up on justification. And I don't think even people like Iris Marion Young and Linda's really comes closer. I don't think they fully appreciate the kinds of gestures that can be made that can play a role in justification, like mere showing, or like showing aesthetically, where aesthetic structure that has a long history behind it, where critics actually need to a critical eye needs to set out some of the history to understand why two 14-year-old Black girls dancing classical ballet in front of a graffitied statue of Robert E. Lee is the kind of gesture that it is. Does that answer the second question well enough?
Yes, it does. Thank you. It's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Martin.
Yes, thank you so much. This is super interesting. I like the options you outlined. So we've got the sort of weak understanding where we say, well, these acts, they can spark deliberation or they can cause deliberation. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. That's, I think, what many of these people, Just Stop Oil, I think, is one of the things they literally say. But then you've got the stronger accounts. So as I understand it, there's on both of these are genuine acts of deliberation. They really partake in the discussion. But then you say, we can say that this is itself discursive, or we could make room for a kind of non-discursive act of political deliberation. And I was just curious where you saw the aesthetic slot in, because I think that these three options you could also just apply to civil disobedience in general, or you could ask yourself, what does this do? And some people might say, it merely causes deliberation, or that's the aim. Other people might say, no, actually it does something stronger. And I even see some room for making these two distinctions, or making that distinction between discursive and non-discursive. So when the Just Stop Oil activists spray paint on a expensive car showroom, they might say, this actually has a very important non-discursive component, but still it really should be taken to be an act of political deliberation. And I was curious where you stand on that, because there's another way of looking at it where you would say, no, actually the aesthetic here, the aesthetic element of aesthetic civil disobedience really helps us to see that, or maybe even uniquely realizes, or is uniquely placed to realize this kind of non-discursive act of deliberation. So I'm just curious what your view is there.
So I would, so I want to land on the aesthetic element is crucial to actually appreciate the non-discursive element is where I want to land at the end of the day. I think it's true that I don't know what I want to say about the middle choice. So clearly the aesthetic can catalyze, that's fine. And then the aesthetic could be doing non-discursive catalytic work. And I don't know now whether I want to say that the aesthetic only does non-discursive work. And that's, I have been trying like hell for most of my career not to land on an account of the aesthetic, but I think I might need to here. And if I do, then I might say, look, it's what's interesting about the aesthetic is its non-discursive elements, right? They could be tied very, very closely to discursive elements. And so, but the way that they're interesting in nearly every point where we're tempted to say the aesthetic instead of the artistic or something else, is the non-discursiveness. And so, and part of the reason that I hesitate to say this is because I don't know what I think about the aesthetic. So that's one. Two, when I think about the aesthetic, I think about the way that in order for the aesthetic to work, it takes part with a massively discursive critical background. And so all of my accounts, when I defend the claim that no, really, I don't mean artistic, I mean aesthetic. When I defend that claim in the paper, I just engage in art criticism and a little bit of history of art history, right? And so the squaring my thought that no aesthetic without criticism, which is discursive, which is largely discursive, not entirely discursive, makes me queasy about how to make the distinction that you're pushing me to make. Does that make sense? Should I be queasy about that, or should I just rest easy like Adorno and just say like, oh no, it's fine. Of course, everything, a work calls forth criticism. It's part of this is its goal, but a calling forth of criticism and then a reshaping of criticism through an encounter with form, of course, isn't merely discursive, right? I could go that route relatively easily, but I don't. Then I'd have to read more Adorno. So how worried do you think I should be given?
No, not. I mean, not at all. I can see that if you want to say no, it's really the aesthetic that can get us there to this non-discursive deliberation. That's a strong claim. Yep. And it would have to be something that indeed follows from a conception of the aesthetic. I don't really see any other argument. Which that's it. It is a question that we should all ask ourselves anyway. So
right. So this is one last thing. Jerry Levinson has been pushing me since I first started talking about aesthetic disobedience to stop calling it aesthetic disobedience, because really it's artistic disobedience. And the more I've pushed back, and he's like, it's euphonious. Like I understand why you choose it as a title, but really it's not aesthetic, right? And I've been more and more assertive about that. No, really, it's aesthetic. And so I think I need to pay that debt at some point.
Good, thank you both. All right, I've got purely chronological order, or by order of putting out a hand either in the chat or on the screen. I've got Nick, then Tsachi, then Angeliki, and then John, I think. Okay, so Nick.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is perhaps just a simplistic version of part of Martin's question. I got a little confused about the relation between the characterization of aesthetic civil disobedience and the second of the strong arguments. So the characterization of aesthetic civil disobedience tells us under 3.1 that the act's aesthetic structure is an integral part of their public communicative function. and that, without giving us an account of the aesthetic, that tells us something about the notion of the aesthetic, or the what makes these things aesthetic, right? But then the second strong argument, which the non-discursive stuff in relation to effective expression, that sounds very much like a characterization of the aesthetic in terms of the special content of certain communicative acts rather than the special structure of the acts. So, I mean, so my basic point is that in the first case, in the definition, it seems to be something to do with the structure of the relevant acts, the structure of the communicative acts that gives them their aesthetic character. But the response, the argument based on Neufeld, etc., seems to suggest that there's something distinctively aesthetic about the content of the acts rather than their structure. And I was just wondering am I reading too much into the word structure? Is the conception of the aesthetic here capacious enough to include both structure and content? I just thought I must be missing something.
Yeah, no, you're discovering something that I'm missing, I think. So I meant structure, and I hoped that the gestures would. So you call attention to the way that you call attention to the. Yeah. So I guess there are two different. It's a really good. It's a really good question. So yes, I would hope. So I hope that the account of the aesthetic calls attention both to the sort of structure and the content of what we're talking about, the structure of how we're talking about the thing and the content of how we're talking about the thing. So I take it that yeah. Would you say a little bit more to help me, because it'll also give me time to think. But could you say a little bit more about why you take the non oh, I see. So because non-propositional content, that's why. Yeah, that's why. Yeah, no. So I hope. Yeah, I have to distinguish between these two things, it seems to me, and I wanted it to be. I wanted the attention to be drawn to aesthetic structure and how we draw, and I want the aesthetic structure to do work. But in the second case, the thing that's doing work is how we talk about the aesthetic structure, which is the content of the thing that we're talking about. Yeah. So is that, yeah. So it seems to me that it. Yeah. Huh. Right. So there are two different things that might be doing work. In the second case, we might think about it as being sort of art critical talk about the work is doing work. So the content of the second case looks, the way that I put it makes the second case look like it's a sort of critical contribution about some aesthetic content. And in the first place, the aesthetic content is, or the aesthetic structure, sorry, itself is doing the work. And so I need to have an account, this is good for this group, I need to have an account of how either, I need to be consistent and talk about how the aesthetic structure actually goes, or this is actually super, super, super helpful, in this, have an account of how criticism about the aesthetic structure of a work in a public context actually works. Is it just that we're talking about different stuff, or is the form of criticism different when it's talking about the different stuff? I want to say the latter. I want to say that the kind of criticism that we do in the public sphere about aesthetic structures has many different shapes that don't track nicely the ordinary propositional ways of speaking in the public sphere. So yeah, that's super. Was that an answer?
It sounded very answerish to me. Yeah, no,
okay.
good.
All right.
Yeah, I think yes, that was an answer. I think yeah, there's just something tricky going on about the relation between the structures of the acts and their distinctively aesthetic structure and their distinctively aesthetic or distinctively affective content.
Right.
And if one wants the structure to be doing the real work, then if one's going to appeal to the capacity of art for subtle, effective expression, that's going to have to be, that capacity is going to have to be somehow derived from the structure.
Right.
This wasn't meant to be like some terrible gotcha.
Oh no, I didn't hear it like that at all. It sounds it's extremely helpful because that part of this part of the paper is like at best half baked at the moment. Cool. And so this is exactly the super helpful comment. So yeah.
If I can just thank you, Nick. If I could just add very quickly, there also seems to be something about what you think of as the aesthetic structure, which is such that it is at least partly determined by its relation to something outside the thing, right? So I think of aesthetic structure. I mean, I thought you thought of aesthetic structure as something to do with really the relation between the act and that and the kind of and that which it is being disobedient about, if you like. So there is a kind of a structure which extends outside of the act of civil disobedience, if you see what I mean. So it's not just internal content either. It's just something relational.
Right. Yep. And this goes back to my difficulty with Martin's question as well, right? That the connection to the connection to the political aim is part of the structure often, and and the structure's relation to the art historical context that it's drawing from and the political context that it's drawing from is like the structure is non-separable from that stuff on my view. So yeah.
Good. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up any time. Okay, we've got Tsahi next.
Yes, thanks. I've learned a lot from the essay and from the presentation. I was thinking about this analogy between political disobedience and aesthetic disobedience, and one disanalogy is that political disobedience is kind of a binary category, so you disobey or you do not disobey, and you can be more or less effective in what you're achieving. With aesthetic disobedience, you want to say, okay, you're disobeying, you can be effective, but there must be, or perhaps you disagree, a dimension of how good this is as art or as aesthetics. Okay, so you might say they were pouring soup on Van Gogh. Okay, is there room to say something like, look, if you didn't pour soup, if you poured some other stuff or you wore something different, okay, this would have been better as art. It would have been as effective.
Yeah.
Okay, but is there a dimension of better or worse in terms of as aesthetics, as art, in your theory?
There's, for aesthetic disobedience changing the art world, there isn't. And I've thought about so it might be, so no, short answer, no. So for example, there are interesting cases of aesthetic disobedience that I think are striking and not great as art or aesthetic. So this guy, or are structured weirdly because the person intended to do something that they ended up not doing, but they did something else that was cool. That makes you think about the act as I don't know, in interesting ways. So for example, the guy whose name I don't remember at a Florida museum, whose name I don't remember, who was protesting the display of Ai Weiwei works, and it did, where he and it was a bunch of old vases that he had just dipped in tempera paint, right, or painted in garish colors, and sort of defiled these antiquities, and they're all over. They're all over the display. So a local artist was mad at the museum for not displaying more local artists, and he went in and picked one of and looked at the triptych of Ai Weiwei dropping one of these vases on the floor, and he looked at that and picked up one of the vases and dropped it on the floor, having no idea that it was $1 million vase that he was dropping on the floor. He just thought, oh, cool. And these are just some crappy things that he got from Home Depot because look at the paint, and then dropped it. So striking and interesting, sort of an interesting, it was a fascinating, I think it was actually kind of an interesting artistic performance that he performed, mirroring and protesting something that it was not a great protest. The museum actually did quite well by local artists. That he had no idea what he was doing also made it slightly not great as an active aesthetic protest. But maybe the aesthetic quality of it was sort of interesting, like made it more interesting than it would have been otherwise. But I think it also, so ineffective, aesthetic, disobedient intervention, but aesthetically kind of cool. The only reason I talk about it because aesthetically kind of cool and funny. And I think it goes in the opposite direction as well, where you have something that's aesthetically not a fantastic intervention, but does interesting political work. And certain acts of booing or protests or intervention on stage will do that. I take it that it's aesthetic because it's an intervention in the aesthetic space. Not that interesting as an aesthetic object or as an aesthetic act, but can often be really effective at protesting the performance of Wagner in 1982 in Israel by Zubin Mehta when he tried to perform, I think it was Tristan. And someone went up onto stage, a survivor went up onto stage and touched his arm, right? So artistically, but politically and aesthetic disobediently, an extremely powerful act. So I think the two come apart in interesting ways. So the theory doesn't say anything about that, but I think it would be a good thing for me to be able to say more, because most of the the pictures that I provide are aesthetically striking and interesting, like the top view of the monument, or the two girls dancing in front of the Lee monument, all sort of depend on good aesthetic impact. So I think the two are connected, but it's not internally connected.
Just to throw something as a suggestion, be very short, adaptation theory. Adaptation theory would give you an aesthetics. Okay, because you want, in good adaptations, you want to have a tight dialogue between intervention and the source work. And the more the dialogue is interesting, then you have a distinct aesthetics for the aesthetic component of the disobedience, as opposed to the politically effective branch of that.
That's extremely helpful, because I'm doing a thing on adaptation right now. So this is so that's great, of Melville. So perfect. Thank you very much. I hadn't seen them connected, but I do think about them parallel all the time. So super helpful.
Great, thank you both. Angeliki. We can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Yes, my question is more theoretical, if I may say so. And it initiates from some poets throughout this paper. Thus, do you believe it will be good to insist more on the qualitative differences of some theoretical cases that you do not use as much in your scheme? For instance, I am referring to Jacques Rancière or Chantal Mouffe. And my question concerns whether you believe that it will be good to refer to the qualitative differences of these theoretical schemes, although you mentioned regarding Rancière, for instance, that this issue needs a whole paper, and your footnote number 17 on page 16. Nonetheless, it seems like throughout this paper that Jacques Rancière and Sandalmov are exactly the same thing, or they are under the same umbrella, that of radical democracy. Nonetheless, if that is my reaction and my response to their work, and I dare to say that even though Jacques Rancière is a highly prolific writer, I think that I have the whole vision of his broader, ongoing, of course, work. I believe that they have substantial differences, and moreover, Sandalmov, for instance, criticized Rancière that Rancière doesn't have strategy in his work and in his ideas, that his theses don't have a strategy, don't have a political impact. On the other hand, Jacques Rancière answers to this criticism, and okay, for me, Rancière is a very innovative writer and with various virtues that I cannot refer in this frame. He's a very thought-provoking writer. So, do you believe that it will be good for your project, though you have a specific perception, say, of that idea you explore, that it will be good to persist in these differences that we may detect in Rancière and in Moff? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, no, they're deeply different in a bunch of ways. The way that they're similar is in their rejection of the kind of justification that is at the center of this. And Rancière has a much richer account of the aesthetic that I think is more promising in sort of crossing over to the deliberative side, and even though he would reject this, right? So yes, the short answer, yes, it would be good ultimately for me to engage in both of them in a little bit more detail in order to show that even though they both fall on the anti-justification, anti-political justification side in political theory, that I actually think Rancière's aesthetics betrays that political move. But that's a sort of whole paper on Rancière, which this ain't. And this is partly just all the most boring answer possible. The journals that I'm aiming at with this don't know Rancière at all. And I would need to explain in much more detail in order to get to the differences that make Rancière interesting for the project. So you're totally right that it's a really rich vein that's not at all mined by this particular paper. It's in part not at all mined because I'm making a broad point about deliberation, and they are on the other side of the deliberative divide. But it would be yeah, no, that's the end. Yeah, thanks.
Good, thank you both. We've got one more question, which I hope everybody has time for. John, you want to raise some, if there are more people, more questions, more comments, I think we might have to leave it for another time, but of course, feel free to email John, right? But John, over to you now.
Okay, I have an anecdote I'm going to turn into a question. So you know how much I like this paper. I think I'm going to use this example to raise a question about site specificity, and perhaps suggest you might need to build that into your definition, because in this case, site specificity functions in a way that's much more complex than it does in debates on memorials and public art. So here's the example. For those of you who have better things to think about than American politics, 2 years ago, Breonna Taylor, after George Floyd, was one of the faces of the protest. And she's from my city, and the city was over. It was very intense here. It was effectively a military zone for 2 months, and her face was everywhere. Almost all the memorials, buildings had Breonna Taylor's face projected onto it in some manner. So she was the face of protest. After things simmered down, the local museum, seeing an opportunity, decided to collect some of the public art in a highly curated fashion and have a show in the museum. And it got a lot of positive attention from the New York Times and national art journals. It was abhorred by the local community. So what's interesting is when you took some of this public art and put it in a museum space, it still had the same recognitional function. The structure seemed to communicate the point and the manner in which you describe, but it was accused of being an example of appropriation or turning these issues into middle-class chatter rather than properly political forms of discourse. So there's something about placing that art in a public space that happens to be a museum that seems to nonetheless be all wrong to enable the kind of discussion that matters to your debate. I'll stop with that.
Yeah, and that's, so these are really good, like that example, the example of the early like 1982, 83, 84 interventions into New York City with AIDS activism billboards that were sponsored in part by the city, that were just revived after maybe it was 80. I don't remember what the date was. There was just a big anniversary, and they put them all back up again in Manhattan. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, what? These are very, I mean, it's an interesting sort of historical marker. But now in this Manhattan, in this Lower East Side, to have those signs up is something very, very, very different than it would have been before. And plucking. I mean, it's a bit like putting political protest into museums, like, oh, look at the pretty outfits, points back to Elizabeth's comment that the structure that I'm talking about has legs beyond the object itself, and the aesthetic structure is connected to the politics and the space of sort of supporting it and behind it, and uprooting it and putting it into a museum makes those very, very, very different. Because Jen Lena, when I talked about monuments, like on Facebook or something, and we talked about museumifying monuments as a kind of resituation of monuments, which I think is a bad idea for a bunch of reasons. Lena thinks it's a bad idea because of the background structural legs of museums are more deeply racist even than the public spaces that they were in to begin with. And so the museum context in the US especially, into which these things are put, and which then the work itself situates itself within, transforms how you see transforms the structure, right? Transforms what we were calling the aesthetic structure before, or plucks it from its actual aesthetic structure, which is tied to the politics and art historical context that I talked about with Elizabeth. So does that make sense?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you for that.
Sorry, thank you, John. Does anyone have a very small comment or question or thing to raise? There's so many things to talk about in this paper, but we're very grateful to Jonathan for sharing it with us at this stage. We hope to be able to continue discussing the content with you, because it seems very promising and an important topic. But for now, in that case, just let's thank you.
Thank you for watching this recorded seminar in the series The Prospect of Criticism, part of the Templeton-funded research project, Knowledge, Perception and the Prospects of Criticism. If you'd like to find out more about the project, to learn about upcoming events or watch other recordings in the seminar series, please go to our website www.knowledgeperceptioncriticism.com.